there's a real Tibet and an imaginary Tibet. This is about a journey to the real Tibet. But it starts out with imagination filling a blank space on the map. Tibet was a closed culture. They nurtured the complete transmission of the Buddha's teachings for 1,000 years. Where it fell away in the lowlands, they hid it in the mountain fastness. Everything changed when the Chinese Liberation Army, as it was called, invaded Tibet in 1950. And it opened it in a way that had never been opened before. There were various troubles that resulted from that 1950 invasion. It was basically a colonial move. And the PLA, People's Liberation Army, were at first very helpful, and they were bringing in infrastructure which was useful. But they gradually tightened the screws. There were mistakes were made. Somebody decided to plant rice rather than barley, and the rice died, because only barley grows at that altitude. So there were a lot of things going on. As things got worse, there was an uprising in 1959. That's the year that the Dalai Lama and 100,000 others escaped from Tibet, forming the diaspora of Tibetans in exile. They're to be found all over the globe. And meanwhile, in the home country, there was a brutal suppression of the uprising. People began to be put in concentration camps. And of course, many had died of the famine. So when control was consolidated, 1 million Tibetans had died. And since then, Tibet has been overwhelmed with an influx of Han Chinese settlers. The sacred city of Lhasa was slowly transformed, and now it looks more like Chinatown than it does like old Lhasa. There are several pockets, however, of old Lhasa neighborhoods, and that's where we stayed when we were in Lhasa. I should backtrack now. There were 12 of us. We called ourselves the Holy Molies because we were clearly on a pilgrimage, not just as ordinary travelers, but as pilgrims. And getting in the country was the first barrier, or one of the early barriers, I should say. And we had to get Chinese visas in Kathmandu. All they would issue was a group visa. They prefer that for visitors to Tibet. But they wouldn't let our teacher even go. They barred his entrance from the country. He had a Tibetan name. He was with a group of Anglos. I don't know what they didn't, what the policy was. It keeps changing. Anyway, we decided to go on our own. We were issued a group visa. And before we knew it, we're in the clouds over the Himalayas. And it was so cloudy that we only saw occasionally when a mountain emerged out of the fog and then receded back into the clouds. Lovely sight, though. Really impressive mountains, those. And then we're over the Tibetan plateau. It's high desert with some green showing. We went in August of 2007, just before the Olympic Games. The reasoning being that they would loosen up, that the Chinese colonial authority would loosen up a little bit because of wanting good press for the Olympic Games, but they didn't. They just didn't clamp down until after the Games, and so it went. Constant constant battle for the hearts and minds of the Tibetans. It's really sad to see. On the positive side of the scale, even though the Cultural Revolution destroyed a huge number of artifacts of the Dharma's presence in Tibet, they couldn't destroy all of the Dharma, because Buddhism, the teachings of the Awakened One, had permeated deep into the Tibetan culture. And they're now making a war on that culture. They're not only trying to destroy the religion, they're trying to destroy the folk culture of Tibet, to keep a phony facade, people with katas mimicking what used to be old tradition, but they don't want the old traditions to actually survive, apparently. The landscape in Tibet is extremely beautiful in August. The wildflowers are out. The crops are growing. And people love to be in the warm air because they aren't a lot of the time. And you can tell there are very thick walls on the houses, and stacks of firewood are to be seen. When we landed in Lhasa's airport, which was quite a way south of the city, the Chinese authorities checked us through the checkpoint readily. Our papers were in order. And the people from the travel company met us with a tour bus. And this was an industrial strength bus from India. And we had 2 monk drivers and a very good guide. So we went into Lhasa, and that adventure began. I should mention that what I'm about to tell is one traveler's tale when there were actually 12. But the HIPAA rules may apply, and if HIPAA doesn't, it doesn't matter, but I decided to let the other 11 tell their own stories at another time. Two of our number has already made slideshows. We'll have to see what transpires. Anyway, it begins to sound like I was traveling alone, which I wasn't. There were 12 of us. We made no effort to hide the fact that we were being pilgrims. We did all the devotional activities we could find to do. We'd bow in front of the temples before going in. We were always very respectful of our surroundings. When we got to Lhasa, we went directly to the Yak Hotel, which is Tibetan-owned. The itinerary, which we did have to file with the authorities, the itinerary included 4 days in Lhasa, I believe it was. And very conveniently, the bus was parked in the courtyard of the hotel. The travel company was really top-notch. They served us very well. They took care of us. They had offices on the premises of that hotel, and they supplied yak trains, kitchen tents, cooks and attendants. The journey involved 2 treks, one of them 4 days, to Sakyia, the first monastery ever built in Tibet. The undercurrent, however, is sadly restive. They couldn't possibly like what has happened. The Tibetans are in the same kind of situation that the Native Americans were 100 years ago. They've been invaded, and the invaders are attacking their culture and their language. And the result was that they became last-class citizens in their own country. and everything had been taken. There's such a flood of Chinese settlers that there are only little pockets left in some places. We adhered to our itinerary pretty closely, and luckily it was designed by our teacher. So we hit most of the high points of the spiritual remainder of Tibet. There were 6,000 monasteries. Now there's hundreds. The PLA used them for target practice, and during the Cultural Revolution, the effort was made to destroy all the old stuff they could find. I should mention that we were very well treated, both by the travel company and by the Chinese authorities. The accommodations were clean and excellent, if a bit rustic in places. Our Tibetan retinue were very enthusiastic, very good people. Of course, as soon as we arrived at Lhasa, we went to the Jokong. The Jokong is the most sacred building in Lhasa. It is, of course, very old, and it's a bit dark in there. It's got shrines everywhere, statues, hangings, and a slightly stressed attitude of deep devotion. You know, there's a little bit of the energy of the occupation in there as well. I personally discovered that when during the full moon there was a festival which happens every month, and I went to it separately. I guess all 12 of us went separately that time. In any case, I was in a long line in the dark with a whole bunch of Tibetans. The man in front of me had some lard to offer as fuel for the butter lamps, and that was probably all he could barely afford. The Tibetans in Tibet are now very poor. They're much worse off than they were before the invasion. The Jokong was not destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. Neither was the Potala, the winter residence of the Dalai Lama. They're kept as museum-like structures. At least that seems to be the intention. Even though there's genuine Dharma in the Jokong, you can sense it. And many pilgrims go there. Again, the colonial authority didn't really like our overt pilgrimage behavior, but they tolerated it partly because they want to make Tibet into a destination, which it already is for many Chinese tourists. And to make it a travel destination, they have to provide the infrastructure, which they're doing. Sometimes in a slightly absurd way. If it makes you feel more comfortably at home, you can find in the glass and steel and neon every corporate logo imaginable somewhere in Lhasa. Again, it's looking more and more like Chinatown all the time. Some of the old structures are retained. The Jokong, as I said, was not destroyed. The Chakpuri, the mountain, was shelled during the invasion, again, possibly for target practice, and it obliterated the Tibetan Medical Institute, the center of Tibetan classical traditional medicine. But of course the mountain was still there. I used it as a sighting when I went on the long pilgrimage circumambulation. But in the dark of the Jokong, it was kind of indistinguishable who was who, except that there were two Chinese military men, officers, which is very unusual. You don't see much Chinese military. They keep at their base. And the one fella made a lot of nonsense syllables, and I laughed, thinking that's a good non-dual deconstruction of mantra. And then I realized he was just mocking the Tibetans. This mockery and humiliation seems to be the common fare in the relationship between the colonial authority and the Tibetans. Then the other soldier came going along the line that we were in, hustling everybody along like so many cattle, hurry up, get going, get moving, and the line slowly progressed to the altars where the gifts could be offered. And as he went by, he slapped me on the butt, again taking control, right? And I'm pretty sure he didn't notice I was an Anglo in the dark. So I got a little bit of a clue what the treatment of the Tibetans is really like below the surface. And I got to admit that it's a beautiful job of window dressing what they've done. The facade that has been generated to try to make Tibet a business hub and travel destination is extremely well designed. And on the surface, everything is just hunky-dory. The trains are on time, so to speak, except there's only one train from China into Lhasa. And not only are the trains few and far between, so are the automobiles and transports, and there's no public transport to speak of in Tibet, which is why our bus came in very handy. Luckily, our monk drivers had nerves of steel because we were constantly on dirt roads with lots of rocks and small boulders. Sometimes the road would just be a creek bed. We were always going up switchbacks on precipices or passing spots in the road that had deep drops. We even, one time on the way out back to Kathmandu on the road from Hell's Gate, saw a truck that was turned over on its side. The only reason it didn't fall off the mountain, fall off the foothill, is that there was a slight ledge, and they had propped up the truck with poles to keep it from rolling over down the hill. So these things do happen, but they didn't happen to us. So we can be glad to say. In fact, excellent things happened to us. The monasteries all had still airs of good energy. There was still a sense of sacrality, ancient sacrality, about many of the venues that we visited. There are two sad exceptions. The Potala, with its 1,000 rooms, has been turned into a museum, and they allow exactly 1 hour to go through the entire 1,000 rooms on a course that had been preset. So we went through maybe 20 spaces or 30, each one different, each one with artifacts, but there was a sense of desacralization in what was a holy building at one time. The only trace of sacredness that remained was in the large room where the tombs of the Dalai Lamas were. And they were shaped kind of like beehives. And I remember the tomb of both the 5th Dalai Lama and the 7th both of them very prominent Dalai Lamas, radiate a kind of a sacred energy, similar maybe to Sufi shrines where the bones of great sages are interred. In any case, I personally had a strong resonance with that particular tomb, especially the one of the seventh. And then we continued on our way, and again we were out by 1 hour after our entrance, and down that incredible flight of stairs on the outside of the Potala. Potala is the name of the sacred residence. It's on an island, residence of Chenrezig Avalokiteshvara. You could call it the main bodhisattva in Tibet. Chenrezig and his devotions are everywhere, or were everywhere. The Potala, for all its desacralization, is still a beautiful monument to dedication to an ancient bodhisattva like Chenrezig, like Guan Yin, like Avalokiteshvara. It's all the same being with different facets. The other desacralized space was in Shigatse, the residence of the Panchen Lama, and that's a whole extra bunch of dirty laundry over the Panchen Lama, which I won't describe in any detail. But even though there were beautiful murals on all the walls, there was a sense, as I say, of desacralization. It just didn't have the vibrant energy that a sacred space has got, and as most of the monasteries exhibited, especially the ones that were a little bit out of the way. There's a monastery around the corner from the Jokong that is a lot less frequented, that had a even better energy, and you could see people actually practicing, which is very difficult these days, of course, for the Tibetans. And I'm amazed at how they've been able to handle the terrible situation that they have with some kind of equanimity, returning love for hate, not hating the Chinese, not hating the cruelty, but not the cruel being, so to speak. I recently had an initiation from a Lama who had spent 20 years in a prison in Tibet. And he found his teacher in that prison. And in spite of all the outrages, the Tibetans really don't hate the Chinese. And if I consider personally the resentments in my own life, how much effort I'm having to put into not hating my enemies, so to speak, at least imagining what it must be like to be them. In any case, the camps are there even though we saw no evidence of any such thing. There were only subtle signs. For instance, I was walking around in Lhasa trying to stick to the Tibetan neighborhoods, making what they call the long circumambulation, which I got out of an old, obsolete guidebook. And it entailed not only circumambulating the Potala, keeping the sacred space on the right, but going past the Chakpuri, the Iron Mountain, behind the Potala, and then back behind the Jokong again. It took all day, especially since the route was not marked and it had been chopped up by new roads and such. And I couldn't even find the Chakpuri I was trying to sight off of it, so I had to keep asking people, and they'd point in the direction that I needed to go. And at one point I came to a wall, and the wall went all along the street I was on for several blocks. Just a blank wall, and then there was a little gap in the wall, and there was a Chinese soldier at attention, eyes forward. I think he was aware of me, I'm not sure. I just passed in front of them, and then there were several more blocks of solid wall. It was a huge military base, and they keep their soldiers inside them so they until they're ready to break heads with some kind of action or counteraction. So it's a cat and mouse kind of thing. It's terrible to see or to hear of. There were only subtle signs. When we got to a checkpoint again, we were stamped right through. But our Tibetan retinue were a little bit uneasy at every checkpoint. Because it meant something completely different to them than it did to us. To us it was just a bureaucratic inconvenience. To them it was carving up their country into isolated pockets, and then developing many of the pockets. I don't know exactly what's being done, but it's not good. And things have gotten worse since then. This is a snapshot of 2007. The people I've talked to that went into Tibet in the early 80s, when it first opened to tourism, report a totally different Tibet. What they saw no longer exists. And what they experienced was a lot rougher than what we experienced. We had a guaranteed hotel room every night. But the people that arrived early were not monitored nearly as closely. They didn't have a system set up yet where, again, the itineraries are filed and there are many secret police about. I had only 2 encounters with the secret police. One of them was in Lhasa when I was on my own. When we got to Ganden Monastery at 14,000 feet, with the trek ready to begin, the yak train was there already. They were grazing. We camped there below the monastery. The monks had a joyous exit from a ceremony they'd been doing and kind of bubbled out of the room, but they didn't engage us at all. We continued through the day, through the night, that is, to camp for the night. In the morning, the expedition to Sakyia, a 4-day trek, started. But I had walking pneumonia, so I couldn't go on the trek. Luckily, there were 2 doctors on board, and they, of course, diagnosed the walking pneumonia and gave me suitable antibiotics for it. So I was okay. I could function, but I had to go back to Lhasa with the bus driver. 14,000 feet was fairly comfortable, but they were going to 17,000 to camp one night, and they say everybody had a miserable night that night. In any case, I made the long pilgrimage when I was on my own, and it looked a lot different. I continued past the Chakpuri. During the time that I was alone, I did the circumambulation near the Jokang quite a few times. It consists in a lot of people walking in a circle, usually around a sacred object, and at a reasonably fast, but not too fast pace. And I was walking around with a lot of old people mostly, which is part of the strategy again. It would be very dangerous for a young person to participate in these devotional activities. So they're clearly playing a waiting game, and they're waiting for the older generation to die out, and they're trying to brainwash the younger ones, which they're unfortunately making some headway at. Anyway, I'm walking around Korwa, the circumambulation. Korwa is the suffering of the world. I was walking around suffering in the Kora, the circumambulation, when somebody that had been sitting by the sidelines, kind of watching the procession, stood up and walked towards me, walked real close in front of me and gave me a huge sneer. And the message was obvious. We're watching you. We don't like what you're doing. Watch your step. And I got the message pretty clearly. I didn't notice whether he was Tibetan or Chinese, but he was certainly undercover something. Anyway, that again reminded me to be a little bit careful, especially the time I was alone, not being familiar at all with the landscape, so to speak. I also encountered some rather culturally ambiguous interactions with Chinese on various levels. I avoided the Chinese mostly because I was there for the Tibetans. In the same way I was there for the Mayans when I went to South Mexico, not for the Mexicans. If I want to go to visit China, I'll go to Wu Tai Shan, the sacred mountain of Manjushri. I'm sure it's open to tourists, and I would enjoy myself immensely. I have a deep love for ancient Chinese culture. I guess you could say that I'm a bit of an antiquarian in that sense. Certainly the modern situation doesn't appeal to me very much. Now, the other encounter with secret police was a little more subtle. On my circumambulation, I got to the place where the Patala is, and along the side of the Patala were quite a few prayer wheels. And I'm walking along, and here's a gentleman with a big prayer wheel, working the prayer wheel, and looking like a pilgrim, but bogus. There was just something wrong with that picture, except I did take his picture. He was an odd-looking fella. Anyway, he's too young to be a real pilgrim. I just went on about my business, ignored him. I don't even know where he went after our brief encounter. But I did the prayer wheels, and I went around the corner, and there were a whole bunch of older Tibetans doing various kinds of devotions. And they were, of course, surprised to see an Anglo there, a foreigner. And they kept their distance. It was unfortunately necessary for us to keep our distance from most of the Tibetans we encountered, except those directly in the tourist service industry. Because if we get too chummy with any particular Tibetan person, they're going to be interrogated later, and you don't want to get them in trouble. And they knew that, and I knew that. And yet I had a subtle feeling that they appreciated that I was there and that I was doing the devotions. And I just followed along and did what everybody else did. Bang your forehead against the wall where the niche with the statue is, and so on down the row. It was quite inspiring, really. And then I went back to the Jokong, and back to the Yak Hotel. I had a strange incident when I came back from Gondan. My huge amount of luggage was loaded into the lobby. You have to take a lot of luggage if you're going to remote Asia. And I went up to the desk. We had just left the Yak Hotel the day before. Went up to the desk and said I would like a room for 4 days. We'd meet the travelers on the other end. So they looked at me and said, okay, where's your visa? Well, my visa is a group visa, and it's on the way to Sakyia. Oh, well, we can't give you a room if you don't have a visa. And I do a double take, not fully grasping the implications of that possibility. And as I said, the travel company took very good care of us. And it happened that at that moment, a honcho from the travel company's office upstairs was passing through the lobby, and he saw what was going on, and he bullied the ladies at the desk into giving me a room. No, he's okay, give him a room. And, they, to save face, they said, well, we'll give you a room if you pay the 4 days in advance. And I said, yes, ma'am, I will do that right away. And I made a beeline to the bank and a beeline back and paid my 4 days and got a room after all. That was what I call a close call. There were a lot of interesting experiences in that hotel. I was fairly bent out of shape, so I ordered a massage and went down to the massage place in the courtyard and got a very good massage, released a lot of muscular tension. And then the woman offered to play with my sex. And ordinarily I probably would have accepted, but I was on pilgrimage, and so I had to hold the power a little bit, so I politely refused. Okay, well and good. Then on the day we were to pick up the trekkers, we had to leave way early in the morning. I think it was 6 o'clock or something, 6:30 maybe. Anyway, I called down to the desk and said I'd like a wake-up call at 5:30. And I don't know why they hesitated, but I said, okay. And I got a good night's sleep that night. And at 5:30, there was a knock at the door. And there was that same woman that had given me a massage the day before in the role of a courtesan. And they were flabbergasted that any idiot would order a woman in the middle of the morning like that. And then I remembered, oh yeah, I heard about that in Chinese style, hotel guests are considered pampered, and they have the highest quality drink, and women are available to them. So remembering that, I understood what had happened. It was what I call a culture cross. They didn't have quite enough English to realize I was asking only for a wake-up call and not for a woman to come visit me. But these things happen to travelers everywhere all the time in one way or another. Anyway, I got back with the bus driver. We loaded up, and away we went. We went down to the river Tsangpo, which is the large river in Tibet. And near the town of Tsedang, there was a boat landing. And sure enough, along comes our crew in a well-loaded boat. They dock, and we have a reunion, and back to the Pigeon Hotel, which was Chinese run. I think it's the only Chinese run facility that we stayed in. And it had a sentimental statue of two Tibetans with katas, with ritual silk welcoming scarves, offering those to the visitor, and the whole thing was totally tacky. And that to me became an emblem of the kind of thing that's being attempted to do a similar thing with Tibetan Buddhism that they did in Chinese Buddhism, which was to have mostly mockery and not much Dharma practice. At least that was their goal. And it's the same goal, of course, in Tibet. There were other amenities. When I was coming back to the Jokong on the long pilgrimage, the long circumambulation, the long pilgrimage route, I couldn't believe it, but I encountered a coffee shop. And this was like a rustic Starbucks. There was no one in there except the barista, and she served me the coffee. And it was decent coffee, There was only one other place in Lhasa I knew about where they played Western rock and roll and had coffee, as well as yak burgers. So having been in the first Tibetan Starbucks, I walked on back and I was still thirsty. So just at the edge of the Tibetan neighborhood there was a Chinese restaurant. I went in there to order some tea. So I ordered some tea and I was waited on by 5 people, 3 of them in suits. And they were very unctuously friendly, but I had my tea already, and they wanted to sell me a super good, expensive cup of tea, a pinnacle of tea for a very high price. And I said, no, thank you, I've got this tea here, that's just fine by me. The interaction was strange in that they were superficially, unctuously friendly, but there was a sense of an agenda back there that I couldn't understand. And there was that same phenomenon when I went to the Chinese museum, the Tibet Museum, put together by Chinese curators. It was in the new guidebook, which didn't have the pilgrimage routes in it, or the mastiff dogs everywhere. They had been taken and eaten, so there was no stray dog problem in Tibet in Lhasa anymore. I decided to go to the Tibet Museum, which is assembled and run by China, but said to be pretty interesting. And so I told the ladies at the desk that I would like to go to the Tibet Museum, and they wrote 2 very clear characters on a piece of paper and said, show this to the taxi driver. And sure enough, I got a taxi, showed the 2 characters to the driver, and away we went all the way across town, through Chinese Disneyland, and arrived at a impressive-looking building, which was the Tibet Museum. I'm going up a long flight of stairs. I get to the top, open the door, and go to the desk, and there were 2-3 people at the desk. They're all overstaffed, partly because Tibet is to be a showpiece of some sort. And they said, where's your ticket? And I said, I want to buy a ticket. And they said, oh, the ticket booth is way down at the bottom of that long flight of stairs. Oops, I missed it on the way up. So I turned around and started to walk back to the ticket booth. And then they unctuously approached me and said, we have decided to give you free admission to this museum. I said, thank you very much, and proceeded to go into the collection. The first item had to do with a case that Tibet has always been part of China, and it covered a 8 by 8 foot exhibit space. And it's an intricate argument. They have a case, but it's a pretty weak case. Anyway, I skipped studying the case against Tibetan freedom, and passed to the artifacts, which were all of extremely high quality. I was totally amazed. Very old, some of them. I especially remember my patron deity was, or is, Vajrayogini in various forms. She's a red goddess image, a symbol of whimsical wisdom, I would say, and many other features. Anyway, there was a beautiful tanka of her. A tanka is a illustration. Usually it's painted on paper and mounted in brocade, but this particular piece was applique, mounted in brocade. So all these tiny bits of cloth were cut out of various fabrics and sewed together to make the picture, and it was a very excellent work. There were other things in there, vajras that were centuries old, vajra being a ritual implement that is often used in ceremonies. I feel moved to say something about the artifacts, but I should say something about the people first. Of course, as I said, we had to stay back a little bit, so we didn't engage very closely with most people, which was a great pity. They're beautiful. They're full of humor and full of vivacious whimsy. They bear the burden stoically. A lot of positive qualities in even ordinary Tibetans, let alone the people that have been trained in a special way to carry the energies that we need as a humanity. And that, of course, is what went away when the invasion took place. Tibet was generating a huge amount of good, compassionate energy which pervaded the planet. And now we have what's called a Renaissance echo. Echo of a situation back in Byzantine days in 1453, when the Turks invaded Byzantium and the scholars fled to Italy with manuscripts that had not been seen in hundreds of years. And now a similar thing has happened to Tibet. Tibet fell to the Chinese invasion, and the scholars took the Pechas and immigrated to the West with them, carrying the Dharma with them. The people that were at all elite in the activity of doing Buddhist practices would be killed if discovered. Most of them fled with the 100,000 that exited at the time that the Dalai Lama went into exile. There was a happy exception to our grueling schedule, and that was one day when the yak train was late. That was in the second trek, which was only 2 days and change. And this was in the town of Shalu, and since the yak train hadn't arrived, we had a day of rest, which we badly needed. Somebody went into the village and bought all the beer that was available, and we had a bit of a party at our campsite. And of course, the children discovered it. And the children are so precious and so spontaneous, and they basically were all over our camp. And we gave them pens and paper. Somebody had the foresight to bring some of those with. And we had a school teacher that assembled a dozen kids that sat around in a quiet circle with no words exchanged, but somehow there was a communication. It was wonderful to see that. And in general, in the countryside, the more remote areas, as best we could muster, we would find people more at ease, more into the flow of the traditional life than in the cities. And again, after Shalu, the trek started. The next day the yaks arrived, and the horses, and away they went. And again, because of the walking pneumonia, I couldn't participate in the trek. So I went back to Shigatse with the bus driver, and again the yak hotel. I didn't like Shigatse. It had a lot of weird energy. I should mention I had very little interaction with Tibetan youth, except when I went to the internet business where I could write some emails. There were probably 5-6 dozen monitors in the place, and almost every monitor had a kid playing video games. But they were pretty immersed in what they were doing, so I only got a glimpse of how they might be faring. But they seemed pretty adolescent in a good way. I like the energy. Again, they're brought up right. I wish ours could be said to be the same in that regard. So even though the young men seemed to be quite all right, there was a very negative vibration in Shigatse. I passed a street, an alleyway really, with door stoops, and sitting on each door stoop was a Tibetan man, dejected, poverty-stricken. It was really sad to see. I did go to the monastery of Tashi Lumpo, which was open to tourists, and it was very beautifully made. I don't know how old it was, centuries certainly. And again, the monks in the monasteries would sometimes engage us, show us artifacts, give us blessings with the founding abbot's shoe or something. And those sacred relics still held the energy. You know, they still had some sacrality to it, so it was really a privilege to be connected to that energy in that way. So it turned out to be a real pilgrimage, and we gained a lot of understanding from it. We went farther into the rural when the trek came out from Shalu. It came out at Ngor, and Ngor is a very remote monastery. When the truck driver and I arrived, the monks were debating in the courtyard, and I ran over to see what debating was like, and they had wrapped up. They just ended their debate, so I missed that. But they welcomed me a lot. There was one monk that taught me some moves, a couple of mudras to not forget, and things like that. And there was a full Dharma practice going on there. It was delightful to see that. The Ngor is a branch of the Sakyia order, which 10 of us were affiliated with. We had 10 Buddhists and 2 fellow travelers on that particular trip. When we got to Sakyia, one of our number had a very large donation for the monastery. The town of Sakyia has a big monastery. And when that happened, magical transformation took place. We became guests rather than tourists. And a lot of things opened up to us. We had a brief but private audience with the abbot of the monastery. We were shown several spaces that are ordinarily inaccessible, like there was the library. Again, very medieval, very Byzantine. The set of locks on the door to get into the library was amazing. We got in there, and there was shelf after shelf of these old patras, which are oblong texts and then wrapped in cloth to preserve them. And row after row of these. And they had a book in there billed as the largest book in the world, which it may well have been. It was the Prajnaparamita Sutra, and they had it arranged so that you could ritually crawl under the sutra in an ambulatory circle. So most of us did that, and again, the air of sacrality was palpable in some places, and certainly under that book it was. Then another honor, the owner of the hotel invited us to have afternoon tea and beer with his family, and so we met 4 generations of Tibetans. They had a nice picture of Mao Zedong on the wall, of course. But by the same token, they were very ethnic in their approach to expression. Lovely bunch of people, and I didn't take the chang, the fermented barley beer. I took the tea, which is an acquired taste, but I've acquired it. It's kind of strong tea with yak butter added, and so it's kind of salty as well. Salt, yak butter, and barley and strong tea, mixed all together. It's very good. Anyway, they served us that. And in that case, it was all right to interact with them closely because they were prominent citizens and indispensable to the overall economy of the town of Sakyia. And then shortly after Sakyia, we went to Milarepa's cave, which was awesome, and to Hell's Gate, which was a little town perched on the edge of the road to Kathmandu. And we got up at 5:30 in the morning to beat the road construction crews and started out. The road to Kathmandu, the main highway, is a dirt road, two-way traffic, including a fair number of trucks, with a situation where there's a Himalayan foothill coming steeply down to the road, and Himalayan foothill going steeply down to an abyss. And there were waterfalls coming down off of the hill, and they would go either onto the road or over the road. And we got to one that was onto the road, and it was a pretty good little creek flowing across the road. And I think somebody had put boulders in there to stabilize it. And the bus driver, as they say, nerves of steel, those monks, got out, waded into the water, moved a couple of boulders around, got back in the bus, gunned it, and we went splashing through that thing. And everybody cheered. Rightly so. We were through the impasse. And then the rest of it was routine, except for that truck that had fallen off the road and not fallen down the hill that we found, or that we came across. They were delayed for 2 hours or so while they brought in a loader to widen the switchback. And we stopped for lunch at the end of the road, and then the driver and the guide had to go back up the hill on that same route. Amazing. I might have been an idiot to go to Tibet. I'm afraid of heights, and I knew I would have to deal with a lot of heights. And sure enough, I had to deal with a lot of heights. And then the height of absurdity, we arrive at Kathmandu, and I get a kid slightly bigger than the luggage taking my bag, and we get to the bus. I gave the kid a bill that was appropriate. He wanted more money, and he had already refused a tattered bill, but that's all I had left, so he got that tattered bill. Apparently, they take it to the bank and they say this is no good, and don't give him the value of the bill. It's not easy for those kid hustlers, but they managed pretty well. In any case, the bus was waiting for us from the travel arrangement, not from that particular travel company, but that I rightly praise so highly. So we're back in Kathmandu and have that adventure, and then the grueling flight home for the other 11. I stayed on in Kathmandu at the Tibetan monastery guest house for 2 weeks after that. And I went to the International Buddhist Academy 3 times to use their library and talk with Lama Jordan. And I went to the Budna, which is that stupa with eyes that you commonly see in the photographs of Kathmandu, circumambulating that stupa. And so the pilgrimage continued. I not only did the circumambulations, but during that 2 weeks I was able to do a 3-day retreat in a suburban monastery in Parping, Vajrayogini retreat, which really uplifted my spirit quite a bit. I would advise anybody considering going to Tibet to do it if possible. It's really a life-changing experience. It's marvelous. There are all kinds of unexpected adventures that await you if you decide to go, if you can go. I suppose there are other people watching this that are just curious about Tibet, probably a lot of Tibetan Buddhists. As I say, for Buddhists, the bottom line is the Dharma, though in distress in Tibet, is fully functional. I remember going to Drepung. They still have 700 monks. The fact that they had 10,000 at one time, it was the largest monastery on the planet. But the current atmosphere doesn't allow for many monasteries anymore. So they still probably have a very large number. And they're practicing hard, the ones that are allowed to practice. What they're not allowed to do is pass it on, especially to teach the young. So there you go. What's happening in 20 years? We don't know. In fact, the whole thing is uncertain. I made every effort to manifest the objective truth to the extent that I can approach it, and everything I said is a reflection of what actually goes on. And as I said, it's gotten worse since then, especially in East Tibet. It's now 2019. It took a long time to digest that journey, and we're still heavily bonded, the holy mollies. We always recognize that deep connection because we went through a major adventure together. It was beautiful. Enough said, I think.